As you may have heard, over the weekend, Donald Trump publicly boasted that he had successfully negotiated a landmark trade deal with China after triggering a painful and unnecessary trade war with the world's second biggest economy, and he promised that details would emerge on Monday. Well, today is Monday, and we have the details. There is no trade deal. He lied. There is a 90-day pause in which both the United States and China reduce, but not totally eliminate, the tariffs they'd imposed on one another. Trump's dishonesty and desperation are so obvious at this point that even a top Fox News business analyst is publicly calling Trump out, saying he caved, he blinked, he was forced to back down, and so are other major conservative publications. Trump is humiliated. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends. Give you just some context here because we have a lot to unpack. As Mediaite reports, quote, Trump was forced to back off. Fox Business reporter drops blunt analysis of Trump trade cave. And we will return to this, okay? Just to give you a palate cleanser. But also for Mediaite, let's talk about the trade war truce, okay? The Trump administration and China have agreed to a 90-day pause in their bruising trade war on Monday, a sudden thaw in relations that slashes reciprocal tariffs by 115% in a deal brokered during a high-stakes weekend talk in Switzerland. The move was confirmed by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who told reporters, quote, the consensus from both delegations this weekend was neither side wants a decoupling. Bessent also praised Chinese officials for engaging seriously on fentanyl, saying it was, quote, the first time the Chinese side understood the magnitude of what is happening here in the United States. The truce peels back some of the harshest duties imposed under Donald Trump's April tariff hike, which sent U.S. levies on Chinese goods soaring to 125%. China hit back with a countermeasure and restricted key mineral exports, rattling global supply chains. Under the new agreement, Chinese tariffs dropped to 10%, while U.S. tariffs fall to 30%, though the 20% fentanyl-related tariffs remains untouched. China's Commerce Ministry called the move a win, quote, for producers and consumers in both countries, urging Washington to, quote, completely correct its unilateral trade posture. So even China is basically saying, we stood resolute, we forced Washington to the negotiating table, and they're basically scolding Washington to back off, to calm down, to relax, okay? So Trump, of course, initially tried to spin this as a trade deal. Trump announces U.S.-China trade deal. That was what the letterhead said of the official White House page. Total bullshit. And even Fox business analysts are calling it out, as well as other conservative publications we'll get to. So let's look at that. While many on the right are taking bows after the U.S. agreed to a truce on trade talks with China, a prominent Fox Business reporter threw cold water on the idea that Trump has anything to celebrate. In a series of posts to X, Twitter, early Monday, Fox Business senior correspondent Charles Gasparino delivered a blunt analysis of the drastic temporary tariff reduction by the U.S. and China and the 90-day pause before any further escalation. Quote, both sides blinked, Gasparino wrote. He quickly followed up by adding, quote, I didn't say we won. In a subsequent post, Gasparino went further. Quote, Trump raised tariffs on the world, the markets, and particularly the bond market, which we need to finance our debt, rebelled, Gasparino wrote. Quote, Trump then was forced to back off. End of story. Film at 11 of the president spinning this as a major victory. Okay, sorry, I couldn't help myself. But what we have seen is a little lesson in how markets exert their power. How when you have to depend on them, as we still do, quote, and remember, it's really the budget deficit that's causing the trade deficit, and we need the budget deficit to maintain our standard of living, you can't go to trade war with the world without bad stuff happening. So they provide this. Both sides blinked. I didn't say we won. And then again, Trump was forced to back off. End of story. I guess the notion that tariffs will pay down the deficit and tax cuts is off the table. Again, calling out the Trump administration for a promise and failing to deliver. Several weeks ago, Gasparino argued that Trump didn't have great leverage in the talks with China and argued the consequence of a prolonged trade war would be dire. Quote, we have a weak negotiating hand here, Gasparino said on April 24th. Quote, I know the president keeps saying we don't. We're almost in a recession. We have markets that are on edge. We need people to buy our debt, and China supplies us with a lot of cheap goods. We could see inflation ratchet up dramatically if we don't get a deal with them, and Xi knows this. Remember, the definition of an inflation is two back-to-back quarters of market contraction, of GDP contraction. Well, we had that in Q1 under Trump. So all we need is a second one, and we are technically in a recession. And if you look at the polling on this, the polling is consistently that the American people believe we're already in a recession and are behaving accordingly with respect to their spending habits. This is not good. This is why Trump's polling on the economy is disastrous, despite the fact that he used to enjoy a completely unjustified advantage with respect to polling on the economy. He had the Republican advantage, which they've enjoyed for years, again, unjustifiably, because under most Democratic administrations, most macroeconomic metrics from unemployment to GDP perform better when Democrats are in power. But Republicans have enjoyed a marketing polling perception advantage for decades. And Trump even more so, because he's seen as this mimetic billionaire genius, this business genius. And he squandered it. He's underwater. He is atrocious on the economy. And this is in part why. But again, it's not just a senior Fox News business analyst publicly, sounding the alarm on this. You also have the conservative Sky News, which is Australia's Fox News. They're owned, I believe, by Rupert Murdoch. Consider this. Why Trump blinked in U.S.-China trade war. Of all the fronts in Donald Trump's trade war, none was as dramatic and economically threatening as the sky-high tariffs he imposed on China. There are a couple of reasons. First, because China is and was the single biggest importer of goods into the U.S., and second, because of the sheer height of the tariffs imposed by the White House in recent months. In short, tariffs of over 100% were tantamount to a total embargo on goods coming from the United States' main trading partner. That would have had enormous economic implications, not just for the U.S., but every other country around the world. These are the world's biggest and second biggest economies, after all. So the truce announced on Monday by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is undoubtedly a very big deal indeed. In short, China will still face an extra 30% tariff, the 20% levies cast as punishment for China's involvement in fentanyl imports, and the 10% floor set by Liberation Day, on top of the residual 10% average from the Biden era. But the rest of the extra tariffs will be paused for 90 days. China, in turn, has suspended its own retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. The market has responded as you probably would have expected, with share prices leaping in relief. But that raises a question. Is the global trade war now over? Now that the two sides have blinked, can globalization continue more or less as it had before? That, it turns out, is a trickier and more complex question than it might first seem. And actually, on that score, let me go ahead and play this clip right here. Just kind of adding context to that.
That the self-imposed, essentially trade embargo on the world's two largest economies is no longer in place. However, over the course of the next 90 days, there are still very significant tariffs that are in place. Now, what does this all mean going forward? It means worst case scenarios, again, put into place by the Trump administration quite intentionally, are no longer on the table. That obviously is very important for the entire global economy, but also small businesses, U.S. consumers, in terms of what was going to happen in the days and weeks ahead. What we know now is there is a process in place and a pathway over the course of the next 90 days for legitimate negotiations between the U.S. and Chinese trade teams, where they are going to try and hammer out some kind of a deal that addresses the president's broader concerns. What we also know is that there's been a shift in kind of the tariff Overton window of sorts. There are still very high tariffs still in place. China maintains a 10% tariff on U.S. goods, all U.S. goods. The U.S. maintains a 10% baseline tariff as well as 20% tariffs that were put in place related to fentanyl. So tariffs are still higher between these two countries than they've ever been over the course.
Right. So again, this is still a problem. It is absolutely a problem. There's still tariffs in place. And one other clip, courtesy of Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss, and then we'll return to the conservative Sky News article and then another article as well from The Spectator.
What is your reaction to this agreement?
You got to give credit to Trump as a marketer. He creates uncertainty and havoc by raising tariffs and then claims victory when he lowers the tariffs that he himself put in place, right? All this does is extend uncertainty for another 90 days. I've been talking to big businesses and global investors. I've been talking to small businesses, including in the biggest city in my district that voted for Donald Trump. I talked to labor unions. They're all saying the same thing, which is uncertainty is toxic for business. It's for hiring decisions, for investing decisions. And he's just kicking the can down the road for more uncertainty.
But
exactly. That's the problem. This is, again, just to reiterate before we go back to the article, this is the issue. Donald Trump's tariff policy inherently sucks. These sweeping, widespread global tariffs, not just with the world's second biggest economy, but Canada and Mexico, two of our three biggest trading partners in the rest of the world, including Europe and the European Union and Great Britain, all these things. It's that he's taking an inherently bad policy and implementing it in the most slapdash, haphazard, ridiculous way. And this uncertainty will have consequences. So let's just say that markets are so relieved that they're willing to take this 90 days at face value and assume that the trade war is over. We are already getting reports that ports in the United States are empty, which means it could lead to supply shortages in various things until new shipments come. So again, we're not necessarily out of the water. So with all that in mind, let's get back to it. For one thing, even if one were to assume this is a permanent truce rather than a suspended one, it still leaves tariffs considerably higher than they were only last year. And China faces tariffs far higher than most other countries. Total up the existing ones and the Trump-era ones, and China faces average tariffs of around 40%, while the average for most countries is between 8 and 14%, according to Capital Economics. In other words, the U.S. is still implementing an economic policy designed to increase the cost of doing business with China, even if it no longer attempts to prevent it altogether. The fact that last week's trade agreement with the UK contains clauses seemingly designed to encourage it to raise trade barriers against China for reasons of security only reinforces this suspicion. The trade war is still simmering, even if it's no longer as hot as it was a few days ago. And again, note that this is a conservative publication because they're willing to call what happened in the United Kingdom as a trade agreement, even though it was really a framework for a potential future agreement that will take months to negotiate and isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, according to JP Morgan and British and American economists. Okay, they want Trump to succeed here. And more broadly, the deeper impact of the trade roller coaster in recent months is unlikely to disappear altogether. Companies remain more nervous about investing in factories and expansions in the face of such deep economic instability. No one is entirely sure that the White House won't just U-turn again. That being said, it's hard not to escape the conclusion that the U.S. president has blinked in this trade war. In the face of a potential recession, he has pulled back from the scariest and most damaging of his tariffs earlier and to a greater extent than many had expected. They're acknowledging Trump blinked, Trump folded. Okay, that's the conservative Sky News, all right, in Australia, again, a Rupert Murdoch venture. Then you have The Spectator. China has won the trade war with Trump. This weekend, the United States struck a deal with China that will see American tariffs on Beijing's exports come back down to manageable levels again, while China will lower its levies on imports from the U.S. The giant container ports on both sides of the Pacific can now be reopened. The factories across China can get back to work, and Walmart and Target can start placing orders again. The global economy can start moving once more, but significantly, it will very quickly become clear who has won the tariff war: China. The deal that was announced this morning in Switzerland, where negotiations took place by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, seems very simple. The U.S. will reduce its tariffs on Chinese imports from 145 to 30%, while China will cut its from 125 to just 10%. For now, it's just a 90-day pause, but it already looks likely that over the next 3 months, a more permanent agreement will be worked out. Again, conservative, they're giving Trump the benefit of the doubt. Oh, this 90 days is a prelude to a more permanent solution, which makes what they have to say even more painful. Stock markets around the world celebrated the news, with equities jumping in Europe and main indices on Wall Street expected to rise 2% or more when they open. If the deal sticks, the tariff war between Donald Trump and China is effectively over. Sure, a 30% levy on the American side is still significant, but there already appears to be negotiating space for it to come down to 10%. Chinese manufacturers are so competitive and make so much progress in productivity that they can absorb that without having too much damage. In reality, the world's most important trading relationship between its two largest economies can get back to normal. The more significant point is surely this: China made very few concessions to get this deal. It has not opened up its market to the American tech giants or agreed to ship fewer goods across the Pacific or to buy more planes or pharmaceuticals from the U.S., or indeed to scale back its attempt to move into higher value industries such as autos, artificial intelligence, or aerospace. Instead, Donald Trump has looked at the potentially devastating impact that cutting the U.S. off from Chinese imports will have on the economy and blinked. He was not ready to ride out the inevitable spike in inflation or the likely recession. For China, that's clearly a victory. The U.S. needs China more than China needs the U.S. With that becoming increasingly clear, the U.S. won't restart the trade war anytime soon, and China can resume its long-term plan of turning itself into the world's dominant economy. Now, I hope that doesn't happen. And under President Biden, for the first time in years, China was no longer on pace to exceed us, to outmatch us, as was forecasted prior to COVID. But Donald Trump seems intent on reversing that. I want to be clear. He's going to pitch this as a trade deal. It's not. It's a 90-day pause. He's going to pitch this as a victory. It's not. Principled conservatives who want Trump to win, who are inclined to grade him on a curve, are calling bullshit on this, from senior Fox News analysts to Sky News to The Spectator. And anyone who tells you otherwise is probably full of shit. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.